imposing silhouette of Taunton State Hospital rises above the trees like a dark monument to suffering and despair. Located in Massachusetts, this sprawling psychiatric facility was once a beacon of hope for the mentally ill, but it soon descended into a nightmare of overcrowding and neglect. Local residents have long whispered about the strange lights flickering in the windows long after portions of the building were abandoned. The heavy stone walls seem to absorb the screams of the past, holding them tight within the brick and mortar. Visitors often report a sudden drop in temperature as they approach the main gate, feeling an unseen weight pressing down on their chests. The air itself feels thick with the memories of those who lived and died within these halls. Established in the mid-19th century, the hospital was designed using the Kirkbride plan, which emphasized natural light and fresh air as a cure for mental illness. The architecture itself was meant to be curative, with sprawling wings spreading out from a central administration building like the wings of a bat. However, the noble intentions of the founders were quickly overshadowed by the reality of funding cuts and a rapidly growing patient population. What was meant to be a sanctuary became a warehouse for the unwanted and the forgotten members of society. By the turn of the century, the wards were bursting at the seams, and the staff was overwhelmed by the sheer number of souls in their care. Deep within the archives of local lore, there are stories that suggest the land itself was cursed long before the first brick was laid. The hospital sits on a hill that was rumored to be a site of ancient rituals performed by those who wished to commune with dark forces. While historians may dismiss these claims as mere superstition, the recurring reports of shadow people and disembodied voices suggest otherwise. The intersection of mental illness and the supernatural creates a blurry line where reality twists and distorts. It is in this gray area that the story of Doctor Elias Thorne begins, a man of science who found himself confronting the impossible within the walls of Taunton State Hospital. Dr. Elias Thorne arrived at Taunton in the autumn of 1920, looking to make a name for himself in the field of psychiatry. He was a man of logic and reason, who believed that every delusion had a physiological cause that could be treated with medicine and therapy. Thorne was tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the pretenses of polite society. He viewed the superstitious beliefs of the orderlies and nurses with thinly veiled contempt. To him, the patients were broken machines that simply needed the right mechanic to fix them. He had no time for ghost stories or whispers of demons haunting the basement levels. Upon his arrival, Thorne was assigned to the men's ward in the basement, a place where the most violent and disturbed patients were kept. The conditions down there were deplorable, with damp walls and little ventilation, creating a breeding ground for disease and despair. The air smelled of mold and unwashed bodies, a stench that clung to the clothes of anyone who dared to venture down. Thorne was undeterred by the squalor, rolling up his sleeves and determined to bring order to the chaos. He began by interviewing each patient one by one, attempting to categorize their ailments and devise treatment plans. However, he soon noticed a disturbing pattern among the men. Many of the patients in the basement ward spoke of a visitor who came to them in the dead of night. They described a tall figure cloaked in shadow who whispered secrets into their ears while they slept. At first, Thorne dismissed these accounts as a shared delusion, perhaps born from the stress of their confinement. Mass hysteria was not uncommon in such closed environments where paranoia could spread like a virus. But the details were too specific, and the fear in their eyes was too genuine to be easily ignored. The patients called this figure the Whispering Man, and they claimed he promised them freedom in exchange for terrible deeds. The atmosphere in the basement ward grew heavier with each passing day, as if the air pressure was slowly increasing. Light bulbs would shatter without cause, and heavy iron doors would slam shut when no one was near. The nurses began to refuse the night shift, terrified of the scratching sounds they heard coming from inside the walls. Thorne remained skeptical, but he could not deny the growing tension that gripped the staff and patients alike. He decided to stay late one evening to observe the ward, hoping to catch a prankster or find a rational explanation for the disturbances. He set up a chair at the end of the hallway and waited. As the clock struck midnight, the temperature in the hallway plummeted, causing Thorne to pull his coat tighter around his shoulders. The silence of the hospital was deafening, broken only by the distant dripping of a leaking pipe. Then he heard it, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards beneath his feet. It was not a mechanical sound, but something more organic, like the collective breathing of 1,000 sleepers. Thorne stood up and walked slowly down the corridor, his footsteps echoing loudly on the cold stone. The humming grew louder as he approached cell number 42, the room of a patient named Samuel. Samuel was a quiet man who had been committed after a sudden violent outburst at his factory job. He had been catatonic for weeks, staring blankly at the wall and refusing to speak. When Thorne peered through the small viewing window, he saw Samuel standing in the center of the room, facing the corner. The patient was muttering to himself in a language that Thorne did not recognize, a guttural and rhythmic chant. The shadows in the corner seemed to writhe and twist, coalescing into a shape that was vaguely human. Thorne blinked, rubbing his eyes, sure that the fatigue was playing tricks on him. Suddenly, Samuel stopped chanting and whipped his head around to face the door, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed a trembling finger at the corner and screamed that the Whispering Man was here. Thorne unlocked the door and rushed in, finding the room empty save for the terrified patient. The shadows had retreated to their normal places, leaving nothing but damp stone walls. Samuel collapsed onto his cot, sobbing uncontrollably and begging the doctor to make the voices stop. Thorne checked the room thoroughly, but found no evidence of an intruder. Yet he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. The following days brought a wave of chaos to the hospital that defied all logical explanation. Patients who had been docile for years suddenly turned violent, attacking staff and fellow inmates with a savage fury. They spoke in unison, reciting verses that sounded like ancient prayers to forgotten gods. The staff was overwhelmed, unable to sedate or restrain the growing number of agitated patients. Thorne watched in horror as his orderly world crumbled around him, replaced by a madness that seemed contagious. He began to suspect that something far more sinister than simple mental illness was at work here. Thorne consulted with the older staff members, hoping to find some precedent for this outbreak of mass hysteria. An elderly nurse named Margaret pulled him aside and spoke in hushed tones about the history of the land. She told him that the hospital was built over a nexus of spiritual energy, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. According to local legend, a cult had once used the hill for their ceremonies, opening doors that could not be easily closed. She believed that the overcrowding and misery in the hospital had acted as a beacon, drawing dark entities back to their feeding ground. Skeptical but desperate, Thorne decided to investigate the history of the site himself, visiting the local library in town. He dug through old town records and dusty newspapers, looking for any mention of cults or rituals. He found vague references to a group called the Circle of the Black Sun, who had vanished mysteriously in the late 18th century. The articles mentioned disappearances and strange symbols carved into the trees on the hill where the hospital now stood. Thorne felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the symbols described in the paper matched the scratches he had seen on the walls of the basement ward. Armed with this new knowledge, Thorne returned to the hospital determined to confront whatever was plaguing his patients. He went back to the basement ward, which had become the epicenter of the disturbances. The air down there was now thick with a metallic scent like ozone and old blood. The lights flickered constantly, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to mock him. He found Samuel in his cell, huddled in the corner and rocking back and forth. The patient looked up at Thorne with eyes that were entirely black, void of any white or iris. Samuel spoke in a voice that was not his own, a deep, gravelly timbre that resonated in Thorne's chest. The voice mocked Thorne's reliance on science and medicine, calling him a fool for trying to cure a spiritual sickness with pills. It claimed that the hospital belonged to them now, and that they would never leave. Thorne stood his ground, demanding to know who was speaking. The entity laughed a sound that scraped against the doctor's sanity and claimed to be legion. The other patients in the ward began to howl and scream in response, creating a cacophony of madness. Realizing that he was dealing with something beyond his comprehension, Thorne decided to try a different approach. He recalled reading about the power of symbols and intent in the library books. If a ritual had opened this door, perhaps a ritual could close it. He knew it sounded insane, a betrayal of everything he had learned in medical school. But he had no other options. He gathered chalk and candles from the supply closet and returned to the hallway outside Samuel's room. He began to draw a circle of protection on the floor, reciting words he hoped would have power. As he drew the chalk lines, the hospital seemed to rebel against him. The pipes groaned and rattled, and the lights exploded, showering him in glass. An icy wind whipped through the corridor, blowing out his candles and scattering his supplies. Thorne felt invisible hands grabbing at his clothes and hair, trying to drag him away from his work. He grit his teeth and continued shouting his intent to reclaim the space for the living. The screaming from the cells reached a fever pitch, a chorus of agony and rage that threatened to deafen him. Just as Thorne completed the circle, the heavy iron door of Samuel's cell was torn from its hinges with immense force. It flew across the hallway and embedded itself in the opposite wall, missing the doctor by mere inches. Samuel stepped out into the corridor, his body contorted in unnatural angles. He moved with a jerky puppet-like motion, his black eyes fixed on Thorne. The entity inside him sneered and raised a hand, causing Thorne to fly backward and slam against the stone wall. Pain exploded in his head, and his vision blurred. Thorne struggled to his feet, gasping for breath, as the possessed patient advanced on him. He realized that his chalk circle was useless against a physical manifestation of this power. He needed to reach the consciousness of the man buried deep inside. He shouted Samuel's name, reminding him of his life before the hospital, his family, and his factory job. He tried to appeal to the human spark that the entity was suppressing. Samuel faltered for a moment, his face twitching as if in a battle for control. The entity roared in frustration, trying to force the body forward. The doctor lunged forward, seizing the moment of hesitation. He grabbed Samuel by the shoulders and looked directly into the black void of his eyes. He shouted that Samuel was strong and that he could cast this intruder out. The connection was immediate and violent, like touching a live wire. Thorne felt a surge of cold electricity course through him, showing him flashes of a dark void filled with malice. He held on, pouring every ounce of his will into the belief that Samuel could be saved. It was a battle of wills fought in the space of a heartbeat. Suddenly, Samuel let out a guttural scream that tore at his vocal cords. He arched his back, and a cloud of black smoke seemed to pour from his mouth and nose. The smoke swirled in the air, forming a vaguely humanoid shape, before dissipating into the vents above. Samuel collapsed into Thorne's arms, his eyes rolling back into his head. The oppressive weight in the hallway lifted, instantly replaced by the normal damp chill of the basement. The howling from the other cells ceased, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing. Thorne dragged the unconscious Samuel back onto his cot and checked his vitals. The man was exhausted and battered, but alive. Thorne slumped against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He was shaking uncontrollably, his mind trying to process what had just happened. He had faced the impossible and survived, but his worldview was shattered. Science could explain many things, but it could not explain the black smoke or the voice that was Legion. He knew that he could never speak of this to his colleagues without being committed himself. In the days that followed, a strange calm settled over the basement ward. The patients became docile and responsive to treatment, and the staff returned to their duties with relief. However, Thorne was a changed man. He became obsessed with the history of the hospital, spending his nights in the archives instead of sleeping. He was looking for a way to ensure that the entity could never return. He found blueprints that showed hidden tunnels beneath the foundation tunnels that were not on the official maps. Thorne explored these tunnels, finding rooms that had been sealed off for decades. On the walls, he found elaborate murals depicting the summoning of dark spirits and the binding of souls. It became clear to him that the hospital was not just built on a cursed hill. It was designed to be a battery for this dark energy. The Kirkbride plan, with its long wings, was meant to channel power, not cure the sick. The founders had been part of the very cult they were rumored to be. This revelation terrified Thorne to his core. He attempted to bring his findings to the hospital administration, but he was met with stone-faced silence. They told him that he was overworking himself and suffering from exhaustion. They suggested he take a leave of absence, implying that his position was at risk if he continued to spread these conspiracy theories. Thorne realized that the corruption went deeper than he thought. The administration knew about the history, and they were keeping it quiet. He was alone in his fight, defeated and fearing for his own sanity. Thorne resigned from his position at Taunton State Hospital. He left quietly in the night, taking his journals and notes with him. He moved to a small town in the Midwest, hoping to escape the memories of the black eyes and the whispering voices. But the shadows followed him. He would often wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the hum of the hospital in his dreams. He spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the day the entity would come back for him. Back at the hospital, the basement ward returned to its grim routine. New doctors arrived with new theories and treatments, oblivious to the battle that had been fought in the dark. Samuel was eventually released, a shell of his former self, with no memory of the possession. He lived a quiet life, but he never went near a church or a graveyard terrified of things he could not name. The story of Dr. Thorne became a cautionary tale among the staff, a legend about a man who cracked under the pressure. Years turned into decades, and the hospital went through periods of decline and renovation. Parts of the facility were closed down, leaving empty wings to rot and decay. Urban explorers and ghost hunters began to break in, drawn by the legends of the haunted asylum. They captured strange EVPs and photos of shadow figures, keeping the mythos alive. The administration did their best to keep them out, erecting fences and hiring security. But the allure of the macabre was too strong. In 2006, a massive fire broke out in the central building, destroying much of the historic structure. The flames reached high into the night sky, looking like the fires of hell reclaiming their own. Many believed that the fire was arson started by someone who wanted to cleanse the hill of its evil. Others whispered that the entities trapped within had finally broken free, sparking the blaze in their fury. The ruins stood for years, a charred skeleton on the hill watching over the city. Today, much of the original Taunton State Hospital has been demolished or repurposed. New buildings stand on the grounds, modern and sterile, hiding the scars of the past. But locals say that the ground itself is still sour. Plants struggle to grow in certain spots, and birds avoid flying over the hill. The tunnels beneath the earth remain sealed, waiting for the day when the seal breaks. The energy that was gathered there does not simply vanish, it waits dormant and hungry. Those who work in the remaining facilities still report strange occurrences. Keys go missing, doors open on their own, and cold spots drift through the hallways like wandering clouds. The legacy of pain and suffering is etched into the very atoms of the place. It serves as a grim reminder that some stains cannot be scrubbed away with bleach and fresh paint. The boundary between the sane and the insane remains fragile, easily shattered by the forces that dwell in the dark. The story of the possession and the mass hysteria is now just a footnote in the long and troubled history of the asylum. But for those who know where to look, the signs are still there. Scratches on the brickwork that look like frantic messages, and a chill in the basement that never goes away. The whispering man may have been cast out of one vessel, but the darkness he represents is eternal. It lingers in the corners of the mind, waiting for the moment when we are weakest. As night falls over Taunton, the shadows stretch long and thin, reaching out from the hill towards the sleeping town. The wind rustles through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of screams from a century ago. It is a place where history refuses to die, where the past bleeds into the present. If you listen closely, you can still hear the hum, the collective breathing of the forgotten souls who are trapped in the stone. They are waiting for someone to listen, to hear their story, and perhaps to set them free. The hospital stands as a testament to the hubris of man, the belief that we can control the mind and the spirit with brick and mortar. It is a monument to our failures and our fears. The darkness that Dr. Thorne faced is not unique to Taunton. It exists wherever suffering is ignored and where human life is devalued. But here on this hill, it found a home, and until the last stone is turned to dust, it will remain watching and waiting. So if you ever find yourself driving past the site of the old Taunton State Hospital, do not stop. Keep your eyes on the road and your windows rolled up. Do not look into the shadows and do not listen to the wind, for the things that live in the dark are always hungry for company, and they have been lonely for a very long time. The gates may be gone, but the prison remains, and the inmates are always looking for a new doctor to play with.